Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners. This week we are taking a closer look at the Tajik-Afghan border. In the recent months, the area appeared in the media in the context of shootings and armed clashes that costed the lives of 16 or even more people, according to the AFP. In August and October 2025, Tajiks and Afghans clashed over environmental issues related to Chinese mining in the area and water. Then, in November, 3 Chinese workers were killed in an armed and drone assault on a mining camp in Tajikistan. Later in the month, another 2 Chinese nationals were killed in a gunfire from Afghanistan. In late December, 2 Tajik border guards and 3 armed intruders were killed during a border clash. And in late January, Tajikistan stated that they neutralized 4 terrorists who crossed over from Afghanistan. What do these incidents tell us about the security situation in the Tajik-Afghan borderland? And what have been the relations between Tajikistan and the Islamic Emirates and earlier the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan? We'll go back in time to the 1990s and then the US invasion of Afghanistan. Joining us is Mélanie Sadozaï, a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Regensburg in Germany, whose work focuses on the cross-border relations between Central Asia and Afghanistan, with a focus on the Pamir region. So she is literally the best person for our topic today. Mélanie has conducted ethnographic research in the Pamirs since 2014. She is also the author of a book titled Tajikistan, Afghanistan, a border at the edge of the Pamir, coming up in 2026 in French. As someone who loves Afghanistan and spent a considerable amount of time reporting from the Islamic Republic and then the Islamic Emirate, I am very excited for this episode. Welcome to Turan Talks. Hi, Mélanie. Thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with talking about what's the current situation at the Tajik-Afghan border, because I know that you traveled to the area not long ago. So what is currently happening there based on your observations?
Yeah, so I was along this border in July 2025, so before the recent attacks that I believe we're going to talk about a bit later. But as usual, as it has always been since the end of the civil war in Tajikistan, the border is calm. It's quiet from a security standpoint. May sound a bit paradoxical because we witnessed a few attacks recently, but the everyday life of the border is not impacted really by clashes, which are a reality. They have been reported by Tajikistan, also by locals. So when you go there, people are aware that there are clashes and attacks going on, but it doesn't affect the everyday life of people. So there are cross-border markets between Tajikistan and Afghanistan that are still operating on a weekly basis. So people go to these markets along the border. They practice consumer practices normally, so to speak. And so I would say that it's relatively calm and spared from any form of violence that we may imagine when we read the news.
So have you crossed the border as well yourself when you were there?
Yeah, I didn't last summer because it's not that you cannot get a visa to go into Afghanistan. It's possible, but it was not safe for me to travel alone on the Afghan side of the border. So I intended to do so, and then my friends on the Afghan side told me it wouldn't be a good idea to be lone woman in this area of Afghanistan.
Let's maybe move back in time a little bit. So how have the relations between Tajikistan and Afghanistan developed since the collapse of the Soviet Union? How were they shaped?
Yeah. That's quite an interesting history to look at because there were different phases. It was not sort of like a consistent relationship between Tajikistan and Afghanistan. So the diplomatic relations were established shortly after the independence of Tajikistan. So in July 1992, the Tajikistan embassy in Afghanistan only opened in 2002, which is explained by the fact that in the 90s, there were civil wars both in Afghanistan and in Tajikistan. So there was a first phase between the early 90s, so let's say 1992 to 1995, when there were civil wars in both countries. And the government of Afghanistan at the time was led by ethnic Tajiks. So it allowed the Islamic opposition of Tajikistan to use Afghanistan as a territory for their operations. So they were, military sort of like bases in Afghanistan for the Tajikistan opposition. It even had headquarters in the north of Afghanistan. So this first phase was really marked by a support by the Afghan government to the opposition in Tajikistan. But however, towards 1995, under Russian pressure, the Afghan government had to kind of stop this support for the opposition. The Taliban were not officially in control of Kabul, but they started to become a reality. And so the Tajik factions in Afghanistan needed the support of Russia. So they kind of had to do what Russia told them to do. And so they stopped their support to the Tajikistani opposition and their supply. And then there was a shift. So the shift in a sense that the Afghan government did not support the opposition. And then there's a second phase that started with a peace agreement in 1997 to stop the civil war in Tajikistan. And Tajikistan started to worry about the Taliban and the impact on the country. So it started to support the Northern Alliance that was comprised of those Tajik leaders in the government in Afghanistan in the early 90s. So that's where there was a clear support of Tajikistan to the Northern Alliance. And then another phase started, of course, when NATO entered the country. So in 2001, a huge change for the region occurred. And Tajikistan entered the coalition led by the United States under the war on terror. So it was another phase when Tajikistan established formal relations with Afghanistan, so opened an embassy. The president of Tajikistan went to Afghanistan in 2005. So there was a renewal in the relationships. And then when the Taliban came back in 2021, we could say there was here another a new phase between Tajikistan and Afghanistan's relations.
And do we know anything about the relations between the Taliban government and Tajikistan when the Taliban movement was still ruling Kabul in the 90s?
We actually don't know much about these relations. I mean, there was nothing made official. And since the Taliban were considered a threat for Tajikistan, the main relations between Afghan actors and Tajikistan were really through the leaders of the Northern Alliance.
Could you explain what happened exactly after the US invasion of Afghanistan from the perspective of Tajikistan? Was it a good news for Tajikistan that the US came to Afghanistan and overthrew the Taliban?
Yeah, absolutely. The thing to notice when the US entered Afghanistan with NATO, the big change was that there was a huge international presence that developed both in Tajikistan and in Afghanistan. So with NGOs, international NGOs, who started to, send a lot of money and a lot of expats. So it became really an opportunity for Tajikistan to outsource in a way the control of the border, to outsource also development of the border regions. So it was definitely a good news for the development of Tajikistan, the outsourcing of the security sector. But at the same time, it was kind of a guarantee that somebody was, so to speak, taking care of the Taliban. And it was just not anybody. It was a big international coalition. So Tajikistan joined the coalition by providing facilities on its territory. So there was a French military base at the airport in Dushanbe, for example. It became logistics for NATO. So the soldiers were crossing from Tajikistan into Afghanistan. And even when there was a gradual withdrawal of NATO troops in 2014, there were still American soldiers based in Tajikistan and going to Afghanistan. So just because of this international presence, it was definitely good news for Tajikistan. And then if we look at the Tajikistan-Afghanistan relations, they really developed. So like I mentioned, an embassy opened. The president of Tajikistan went to Afghanistan. Both governments signed a treaty of friendship. So trade relations, economic relations started to grow. Education also with Afghan students going to Tajikistan. So it was quite positive. And if we look at what happened at the border, so all these international actors that I mentioned were investing in cross-border projects. They spent a lot of money on rehabilitating some facilities along the border to develop people-to-people contacts. So the UN did so, the European Union, the US Embassy, many NGOs, the list is long, but the main one being the Aga Khan Development Network that managed to really fund and create cross-border resources thanks to the stability provided by the intervention of NATO in Afghanistan.
Can we stop for a second at the Aga Khan Foundation? Because it's a very important foundation, especially for the Pamir region in Tajikistan. Can you talk a little bit about that and how exactly the Aga Khan Foundation has influenced the situation on the Tajik side of the Pamirs?
So the Aga Khan Foundation is a branch of the Aga Khan Development Network. So that's the big umbrella, so to speak. So you have different agencies within the Aga Khan Development Network that started to operate in Tajikistan and in Afghanistan, targeting Ismaili communities. So the Ismaili communities are those living in the Pamirs, like you mentioned. So they also live on the Afghan side of the Pamirs in the north of Afghanistan and in China at the border with Tajikistan's Pamirs and in northern Pakistan as well. So they are a border minority.
But also a religious minority.
Yeah, absolutely. They claim to be between 12 and 15 million in the world. So it's really a minority in itself. So the AKDN has started to target the support, the development of these communities already during the civil war in Tajikistan. So they didn't have development projects back then, but humanitarian projects. So they managed to bring food to the Pamirs, which was under a blockade during a large part of the civil war. So that's sort of like the first presence of the Aga Khan Development Network in independent Tajikistan. And then when the situation stabilized with the intervention of NATO in Afghanistan, they shifted to development projects. And so they rehabilitated the bridges that existed between Tajikistan and Afghanistan so that people and trucks and cars could cross. So that's really the infrastructure side of their action. But they also put in place different cross-border programs. They launched medical programs where Afghans could be treated on the Tajikistani side of the Pamirs. They launched also education programs, so Afghan students could go to the educational facilities and participate in the educational programs of the AKDN on the Tajikistani side. There were irrigation projects, so really super local cross-border projects where, water was sent from Afghanistan to Tajikistan and vice versa. They participated also not just at the border, but in the Pamirs in general. They modernized and rehabilitated the electricity infrastructure. So they managed to cover almost the entire region in terms of access to electricity. And with those infrastructure, they opened a cross-border program sending electricity from Tajikistan to Afghanistan. And all of that was really done by the AKDN. It was outsourced to the AKDN by the government of Tajikistan. And so you mentioned the benefits for people on the Tajikistani side. Well, it gave a lot of jobs to people, and the unemployment rate dropped. I don't have the figure, but I heard when conducting an interview there that you had people coming back from Russia to the Pamirs because they knew they could have a job within the Acadian agencies. So it was super beneficial for Tajikistani citizens. And another example I can give is the doctors, so the medical staff working for these medical programs, they were paid much more if they worked for the AKDN than if they worked for public hospitals or public medical facilities. So there was definitely this sort of like economic benefit.
So Afghanistan is obviously a multi-ethnic country, and even up to 30% of its population is ethnically Tajik. So what were those early years of the U.S. intervention like for the Tajiks in Afghanistan?
It's always difficult to give a clear figure of how many Tajiks or Pashtuns live in Afghanistan because there's no clear or thorough survey. So we have different numbers. So the The president of Tajikistan talks about like 45%, but then the UN estimates, mention more like 30%. So we don't really know, but what's definitely sure is that it's one of the main ethnicities in Afghanistan. So in terms of how the intervention was perceived, I guess in the first years, but it's not particular to the Tajiks of Afghanistan, in the first years of the intervention, it was welcomed by Afghans. The Taliban regime in the late 90s was absolutely terrible, very violent. So the end of the Taliban regime was welcomed. But then as NATO got more and more sort of like stuck in Afghanistan and unable to really remove the Taliban, I guess, again, not particularly the Tajiks, but all the Afghans were more and more doubtful that NATO would be successful. So I would say in my opinion, there's not necessarily any particularities in terms of ethnicities when it comes to the situation in post-2001 Afghanistan.
Okay, so then after the invasion, obviously, as you said, the situation is becoming less clear. So the Taliban is becoming stronger and still poses a threat to the government in Kabul. And then in August 2021, the Taliban take over Kabul. The US withdraws very, very rapidly from Afghanistan, leaving loads of equipment and its bases. The Taliban take them over. The Taliban open prisons where all the other Taliban and also ISIS members were locked under the Americans. And what happens then? What does that mean for the local Tajik situation and also for the relations between Tajikistan and Afghanistan?
As soon as the Taliban took control of Kabul, it was sort of like sure that they would run the country. As you may know, Kabul was kind of like one of the last destinations. They had already secured control of a lot of Tajik inhabited areas. So it was already before they arrived in Kabul, the situation started to get very, very tense and bad for Tajiks, who, of course, felt that they would be targeted as a minority, and any minority in Afghanistan was targeted. So some Tajiks joined the resistance under the leadership of Ahmad Massoud, mostly in the Pamir region. So not all Tajiks. It's very difficult to again generalize and say that all Tajiks were supporting immediately the resistance, because there were also ethnic Tajiks who joined the Taliban movement. So I would say it's what's so specific about the Tajiks is that they managed to gather under a resistant movement. Now, for Tajikistan, of course, this was really bad news that the Taliban managed to take control of Afghanistan because of the historical support for the Northern Alliance and the threat to Tajiks from Afghanistan. So, the relationship between the Taliban and Tajikistan was just non-existent in August 2021, and Tajikistan very clearly supported the resistant movement in Afghanistan.
Hey, quick little break. Thanks for listening to Turan Tales. We're a tiny independent show supported by listeners like you. If you like our work, you can get a paid subscription at turantales.substack.com/subscribe or buymeacoffee.com/turantales. Okay, back to the episode. So let's remind our listeners who Ahmad Massoud is, because his father, Shah Massoud, was killed 2 days before the 9/11. So 2 days before the tragedy that effectively led to the invasion of Afghanistan. He was killed in Afghanistan by 2 Al-Qaeda operatives who were disguised as journalists. And this was the moment that was quite important for the situation in Afghanistan and for its future and for what happened. Can you explain a little bit what happened then and why Shah Massoud was so important?
Well, he was a very charismatic leader to start with, and I think his message of pushing away the negative forces that were trying to seize control in Afghanistan, whether the Soviets or the Taliban, was very, very powerful. So not only was he charismatic inside Afghanistan, but he was also very charismatic for Western partners. So he spoke French. He studied in the French high school in Kabul. So he was able to secure sort of like partnerships with French diplomats, French politicians. So I think that was really key to his success as a resistance leader in Afghanistan. He never, left the front. He was always in Afghanistan, except when he had to go abroad to seek support. But if you talk to people who lived in Afghanistan or who were in the diaspora when Massoud was alive, they really saw him as the next leader of Afghanistan. So, of course, his assassination was a big shock. I mean, I remember my father cried that day when my father, who was Afghan, he cried when Massoud was killed. So that tells you a lot. I think there's the charisma and the skills of a leader and of a fighter that were really key. Now, it's important also to say that they are some people in Afghanistan who did not support him, and that they were places in Afghanistan where the people who claimed to belong to Massoud's movement were perpetrating, massacres. But it's in very few pockets of Afghanistan in the 90s, and so I would say that his son is now Ahmad Massoud is trying to sort of like recreate this charisma and this support that his father had. But of course, he has a different story, and it's, the circumstances are really different now.
So what is the story of Ahmad Massoud, the son of Shah Massoud, and what is his relation with Tajikistan?
Ahmad Massoud is in his late 30s. I believe he's like 36 or 35, and he leads the National Resistance Front to the Taliban. So he's one of the people who claims to be leading a resistant movement against the Taliban. He's not the only one. There are other such movements, but he's the most outspoken and probably the most famous one in the West. He has very close relations with Tajikistan, but more specifically with the president of Tajikistan, because of the historical relations between Rahman and his father. It has never been really sort of like claimed or made official, but he goes regularly to Dushanbe. He has kind of a headquarter there, and he's sort of like tolerated by Dushanbe. So the government of Tajikistan does not provide, supply or weapons or financial support, from what we know, to the resistance or to Massoud, but they tolerate him and his movement by just providing sort of like a basis for the movement to coordinate political or military discussions.
After the Taliban took over, Central Asian countries, including Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, started establishing relations with the new government, with the emirate, as they call themselves. And there is a sort of cooperation, even though, as far as I know, the Taliban are not recognized officially by any of the Central Asian governments. There still is cooperation, and there are still, a lot of, for example, infrastructural projects that are underway between Central Asian nations and the Taliban. But Tajikistan was the last country that actually resisted entering into dialogue with the Taliban. Can you tell us a little bit how this dynamic was shaped since the Taliban took over, and what's the situation now?
Yeah, it's quite interesting to focus on Tajikistan, because, like you said, it was the only one country in Central Asia to make it clear that they would not deal with the Taliban. But it became complicated for many reasons. First of all, because of the historical friendship between the president of Tajikistan and the Massoud family, right? There was the need also to keep a narrative of support to the resistance to satisfy Western partners. Right, so Tajikistan has this open door policy, meaning that it deals with all partners, so the West, Russia, China, etc. So satisfying Western partners meant not dealing with the Taliban. Then there was the domestic narrative. So the president of Tajikistan has a very strong ethno-nationalist narrative supporting the Tajik identity. So it's something that's very recurrent in his narrative to keep his citizens satisfied that there's someone representing the Tajik identity. And so the Tajiks of Afghanistan have a space in this narrative, and he used that at the beginning when the Taliban returned to power. He was really emphasizing the need to protect the Tajiks as a minority. The condition for Tajikistan to deal with the Taliban and to recognize their leadership was to make sure that minorities would be incorporated in the government. So that meant Tajiks, but also women. And it's something we often forget. And then another problem was the fundamentalist view of the Taliban, which fuels radicalization. And it's in the view of Tajikistan's authorities, this view could sort of like influence citizens of Tajikistan. So give the message that a fundamentalist movement can topple a government. So that's how it was sort of like interpreted in Tajikistan's view. However, like you said, very interestingly, while there was in the first 2 years no official contact, no official discussion between the Taliban leadership and the Tajikistani government, both embassies continued running. So the Tajikistan embassy in Afghanistan and the Afghanistan embassy in Tajikistan. Electricity companies' representatives met many times. There was a mutual agreement on exporting electricity to Afghanistan that was renewed. So it's renewed every year. And even though the Taliban came back to power, this agreement kept being renewed, right? So it's just very interesting to see that despite the lack of official relations, there was still trade relations and there was still also cross-border relations. But it was very discreet, very discreet. You had to really go to the border to see that there was one border crossing point that was not closed. And as 1 month or even 3 weeks after the Taliban came back to power, this border crossing point reopened and you had trucks crossing back and forth from Tajikistan to Afghanistan and vice versa. So there was sort of like the first layer of, official narrative and then the everyday reality. And today, like you mentioned, so there was a shift. Approximately in the end of 2023, Tajikistan shifted its position, and now we see pictures of Tajikistani officials meeting Taliban officials. So now it's clear, it's public, that they're working together. But like you said, there's no official recognition. So Tajikistan now has a more pragmatic approach, just like Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, which also border Afghanistan. So Tajikistan has to take advantage now of the economic opportunities in Afghanistan. And it's also taking advantage of the tension between Afghanistan and Pakistan. So the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan is very unstable and the border closes very regularly. So I guess Tajikistan is seeing itself as a gateway for Afghanistan, right? So that also explains the shift in its policy and the joint fight also against ISIS. So the Taliban and Tajikistan have a common goal to eradicate ISIS. So we know for sure that intelligence representatives of both countries met to discuss precisely the fight against ISIS. So Tajikistan now have all the good reasons to deal with the Taliban and to stop ignoring the fact that they are now the current leadership, even if they don't recognize them. But it's more pragmatic now than it was in the first 2 years of the return of the Taliban to power.
Before we move to what exactly is happening at the Tajik-Afghan border, I would like to touch upon one more story, which is quite important, I think, or emblematic, that after the Taliban came to power, obviously, loads of Afghans crossed the border into Tajikistan and were living there as refugees. But in the past couple of months, the Tajik government started deporting people to Afghanistan. Why is that? And what happened that so many people got deported?
So first of all, it's not a new thing. When the Taliban arrived, I mean, even before they arrived in Kabul, I was actually conducting fieldwork in July, in June and July that year. And already there were Afghan people who had crossed the border into Tajikistan. So towards the end of July, you had a couple hundreds, I think it's even close to more than 1,000 people crossed into Tajikistan. But they did not stay. Some of them stayed just a few days and then they were sent back to Afghanistan. So they stayed for probably a few days officially under humanitarian reasons. That was what the border guards would say. We helped those poor people, but then they were sent back to Afghanistan. So barely any of them really started to live in Tajikistan after the Taliban came to power. So unlike what we may think, the refugees who are Afghan refugees in Tajikistan, they did not cross by foot the border. Most of them just flew So the fact that Tajikistan is sending them back, is deporting them, is not something new. So, like you said, in last August, there were nearly 1,000 Afghan refugees who were expelled, according to the IOM, and it was illegal, so to speak, because these people had the right documents, and they were just literally kicked out. So why that happens? There's such a big discrepancy between the official narrative of Tajikistan supporting, the Tajiks of Afghanistan, and what they actually do for them. I remember reading that there were camps along the borders that were built for Afghan refugees, and I went to these locations, and there were no camps. So I think they wanted to give the image of a country that's protecting, oppressed minorities, but Tajikistan doesn't have the means to take care of these refugees. I mean, it's the poorest country in Central Asia, so it barely has the means to take care of its own population. So talking about Afghans, it's just not possible. And I think I would talk about some discrimination too. Political discrimination, institutionalized discrimination. The Afghans who live in Tajikistan do not have the same rights as Tajikistani citizens, even though they are documented and they are legally staying in Tajikistan. They can only live in 2 districts near Dushanbe. There's a curfew that they have to respect. So, apart from the traders who have like limited visas and have quite, more rights than the average Afghan refugee, I mean, being Afghan in Tajikistan is not necessarily a safe situation. And most of the Afghans who are in Tajikistan want to leave, and they want to go to Europe or to Canada. So they see Tajikistan as a transit country.
Do you know what's the ethnic composition of the Afghan refugees in Tajikistan? Are they ethnically Tajik mostly, or it varies?
I don't think there's any figure. Probably the international organizations know, but from my experience, most of them are either Tajik, so they are from Tajik inhabited regions of Afghanistan, or Ismailis. So they come from the Faizabad region, for example. I very rarely met Pashtuns in Tajikistan, so mostly Tajiks. And even the embassy in Tajikistan, the Afghan embassy, when I went there in July 2021, most of the staff I met was Tajik. And there was actually the picture of Ahmad Shah Massoud, the father, inside the embassy.
So during the Tajik civil war, there were also refugees who crossed into Afghanistan. Do we know anything about the situation of those people?
Yes, it's important also to look at what happened at the local level, because it still plays a role today. So during the Tajikistani civil war, a lot of people crossed into Afghanistan. And when I say a lot, it's thousands of people. So just to give you one figure, 60,000 refugees came back from Afghanistan to Tajikistan at the end of 1996. So that's the people who came back. So that means that probably there were more people who had crossed before into Afghanistan. It's quite important because they were, taken care of by Afghans at the time. And today, people in Tajikistan still remember that Afghans were helping Tajikistani refugees. So when the Taliban came back to power in 2021, the governor of the Badakhshan province in Tajikistan said that it was the duty of Tajikistan to help anyone coming from Afghanistan because of the help that they provided during the civil war to Tajikistani nationals. And the president of Tajikistan also gave a speech in 2021 in which he said, they helped our citizens, so we have to help them. Well, we saw that the president did not really deliver on that, but it's still playing a big role in the memory of the civil war today in Tajikistan.
That's very interesting. But I'm afraid that we have to move to the main topic of our discussion today. So the Tajik-Afghan border and the tensions that led to several deaths in the recent months. Can we talk briefly about, what happened and who were the people who got targeted?
Yes, so there's what we know and what we don't know. So what we know is that there were 3 attacks that took place in November and December on Tajikistan's territory along the Afghan border. So in November, there were 2 attacks and 5 Chinese workers were killed. and others were wounded. What we know is that these Chinese nationals were working for a mining company and for a construction company, so both Chinese companies. In December, it was 2 Tajikistani military men who were killed and 3 attackers, according to Tajikistani media outlets. So the border guard press service of Tajikistan reported these attacks and also reported that in between those attacks in November and December, there were other attacks that didn't kill anyone. So there was sort of like a series of attacks. We know too is that the Chinese embassy in Dushanbe took that very seriously by calling its citizens to evacuate the area after the first attack. But that did not prevent another one. And the president of Tajikistan, right after the 2 attacks in November, held an emergency meeting. So it was taken quite seriously. On the Taliban side, so high-ranking Taliban officials published condolences and declarations saying that, investigation would be conducted, and they condemned those attacks. But what's more interesting is that there were high-ranking Taliban officials, including the Minister of Mines, who went to the north of Afghanistan, to Badakhshan, to strengthen security and officially to check illegal mine exploitation. So, the link between Chinese ambitions to extract resources from Afghanistan and, those attacks, and actually also from Tajikistan, is very obvious. What we don't know now is who exactly did those attacks. So both Afghan media and Tajikistani officials have blamed Jamaat Ansarullah, which is a terrorist group comprised of Tajikistani citizens, but they also blame drug smugglers. I even came across an article in an Afghan media outlet that said, we have sources telling us it's Jamaat Ansarullah, and then we have sources that tell us it's drug smugglers. So it's hard to know. The Taliban have not blamed anybody in particular. They remain vague. They said elements involved in the attack or those responsible for the attack. So there was never like a clear statement. So, whether it's terrorists or drug traffickers, it's quite hard to know.
And what does this situation tell us about the larger security situation in the region or in the area? Is it getting worse, or is it getting more dangerous to live in the Tajik-Afghan borderland? Or are these just incidents that are one-off and not part of something bigger or like a bigger picture?
Yeah, thank you for this question, which I think is very important. I don't think it's becoming more difficult or less secure to live at the border. In the spring of 2023, there were people who crossed the border from Afghanistan to Tajikistan, and they were armed and they were killed by Tajikistani military. And I was literally in the same district when that happened. I was not exactly at that place, but it was very interesting to see that the fact that these people crossed the border didn't stop the sort of like everyday life of the border. So there's this Pamir highway that follows the border with Afghanistan, and people continued to travel. The only difference was that the controls by the military were more frequent. So they would check the cars more regularly, and they would check the identity of every passenger, which it's not something they do usually. So you see that when it happens, when those incidents happened, it does not stop everything at the border. People are aware that it's happening, but they're not particularly scared or afraid. Last summer, again, I asked people, are you afraid of what's going on in Afghanistan? And it's like they were quite indifferent. So they acknowledge that the Taliban are giving a hard time to Afghan citizens, but they're very, very convinced that this would not destabilize the region or their life at the border. Now, if you look at the attacks and who is targeted and where they happen, these attacks don't take place in villages. They don't target civilians. So in November, it was very clear that those targeted were Chinese nationals. So I would say that, if we think in terms of big picture, I think China has the good reasons to feel threatened by those incidents. But locals, I would say they don't. From my experience in the interviews I conducted, they did not feel threatened. But the situation is very different if you look at the western side of the border and the eastern side. So in Badakhshan, it's like business as usual, so to speak. In Khatlan, it's more complicated because that's where drug smugglers prioritize their sort of like entrance into Tajikistan. And so, drug smuggling is much more a reality in Khatlan. It's much more present in the everyday life of people.
So, the situation on the Tajik-Afghan border is very complex and very interesting as well, because as you just mentioned, we've got drug smuggling here. So a very, very lucrative business that hasn't been stopped by the Taliban, who officially announced a war against drugs. At the same time, we do have loads of investments like gold mines, so like the Chinese investments, but also we do have the Kostepa Canal, so a canal that is now being built by the Taliban. It's a canal that will divert probably up to 30% of water that then flows into Central Asia. So it is probably going to be another point of conflict in this very volatile region. And now, to finish, I would like to ask you, do you see any particular, investments or any particular issues in the borderland that we should be paying a closer attention to?
Yeah, so in terms of investment, I would say definitely look the Chinese investment. I mean, it's really baffling how China went to being quite discreet in developing infrastructure along the Tajikistan-Afghanistan border, and now, you cannot escape it if you go on the highway. I mean, you see Chinese workers, you see sort of like their facilities for the workers. You see flags of China in Tajikistan, slogans in Chinese. I even saw an electric car station on the road in the Pamirs, because China is exporting 50 to 100 electric cars a day through the border between China and Tajikistan through the Pamir highway. So, just the Chinese presence through their investment is something to look at. We don't know exactly the terms of the agreements between Tajikistan and China in rehabilitating infrastructure, but something I was told, I don't know if that's true, but someone in the Pamirs told me that China can extract any resource that they find when doing those constructions. And so there's this huge discrepancy between, what Tajikistan is gaining and what China is gaining there. China is quite free to do anything in Tajikistan. So to me, that's the thing we have to look at, like the Chinese presence in Tajikistan that's growing more and more. And like I said, it's very, very visible. Now to conclude on sort of like a more positive note. So you mentioned all the bones of contention, right? The potential for clashes with Kostepa, with those illegal cross-border movements that prove that the Taliban are unable really to stop these movements. I would also like to focus on, also looking at the border. There are signs of improvement in the region and of development. So, there's this free economic zone that opens between Afghanistan and Uzbekistan. And it's fascinating because it's a zone where Afghan people can enter without a visa. So they cannot go to Uzbekistan, but they can enter this special economic zone. So it's definitely a resource for Afghan people. And then it's a hub for trade between Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. And then the cross-border markets between Tajikistan and Afghanistan reopened in September 2023. And last July, when I went, it was really impressive to see that they were crowded. People from Tajikistan go there because it's much cheaper, because they can find products of higher quality than what they found in Tajikistan. And Afghan traders it gives them another market. So, of course, the fact that the Taliban are in power is creating a lot of challenges. And I'm not even talking about life in Afghanistan and, the horrible domestic policies that they implement. But there are also some sort of like signs of hope for, the improvement of quality of life for people if we look at these small border examples.
Mélanie, thank you so much. That was very interesting and I learned a lot from this conversation. We will be looking obviously at the Tajik-Afghan border and the relations between Central Asia and Afghanistan. And thank you so much, Mélanie, and all the best to you.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for today. Thank you for listening and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.